Something unexplainable was happening in a small cemetery. A bobcat refused to leave, day after day, as if it were waiting for something. At first, people thought it was just a coincidence, but when they discovered the real reason, no one could hold back tears. The story behind this mystery is heartbreaking, and what happened in the end will move you even more. Watch until the end, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more amazing stories like this one. The small town of Pinewood Haven, nestled between the rolling hills of rural Vermont, had always been the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever happened. The main street consisted of a handful of family-owned businesses that had been passed down through generations, and most residents knew each other's business before they knew it themselves. It was the epitome of small-town America, with its white picket fences, Friday night football games, and the kind of community where people still brought casseroles when someone was sick. For Sarah Mitchell, the town's newly appointed caretaker of the Pinewood Cemetery, the quietness was exactly what she needed. At 32, she had left behind the hustle and bustle of Boston, seeking solace in the peaceful surroundings of her late grandmother's hometown. The cemetery job wasn't glamorous, but it offered a steady income and a quaint cottage on the grounds that came with the position. You'll get used to the silence. Walter Jenkins, the elderly groundskeeper who had worked at the cemetery for over 4 decades, assured her on her first day. It speaks in its own way, if you listen carefully enough. Sarah had nodded politely, assuming it was just the rambling of an old man who had spent too much time among tombstones. Little did she know that Walter's words would take on an entirely different meaning within her first month on the job. It started on a misty Tuesday morning in October. Sarah was clearing fallen leaves from the older section of the cemetery when she noticed something unusual near the chapel. A bobcat sitting perfectly still beside a weathered headstone. The wild feline, with its distinctive spotted coat and tufted ears, seemed completely out of place in the manicured cemetery grounds. "Walter!" she called out, keeping her eyes fixed on the animal. "There's a bobcat here. Should we call animal control?" The old groundskeeper approached slowly, squinting through his thick glasses. When his gaze landed on the bobcat, a peculiar expression crossed his face, not fear but something akin to recognition. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. "He's back." Sarah turned to him, confused. "Back? You've seen this bobcat before?" Walter nodded, a wistful smile playing on his wrinkled face. "That's not just any bobcat, Miss Mitchell. That's Rusty, or at least that's what Frank used to call him." "Frank?" "Frank Sullivan. He was the cemetery guardian before me, retired about 15 years ago. That bobcat used to follow him around like a house cat when it was just a kitten." Walter pointed to the headstone where the bobcat sat. "That's Frank's grave right there." Sarah stared in disbelief. "That's impossible. Bobcats don't live that long, and they certainly don't mourn people." "Maybe so," Walter conceded with a shrug. "But that doesn't explain why this one keeps coming. Back to that particular grave, does it?" Over the next few days, Sarah documented the bobcat's behavior, intrigued despite her skepticism. The wild feline would appear every morning at dawn, sitting vigil by Frank Sullivan's grave until sunset. It never approached visitors or other staff members, and it showed no interest in food left out for it. It simply sat there, amber eyes fixed on the headstone as if waiting for something or someone. "I've been doing some research," Sarah told Walter a week later as they shared coffee in the caretaker's cottage. "Bobcats are solitary creatures. They don't form attachments like this, especially not to humans." Walter sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "There are things in this world that science can't explain, Miss Mitchell. I've seen that bobcat bring small objects, leaves, pebbles, even a bird feather once, and place them on Frank's grave, almost like offerings." The very next morning, as if to confirm Walter's words, Sarah witnessed the bobcat gently placing a small pine cone on the grave before settling into its usual spot. She captured the moment on her phone, her hands trembling slightly. When she showed the video to Dr. Jeremy Collins, the local veterinarian, his reaction was immediate disbelief. "This isn't normal behavior," he said, his brow furrowed as he replayed the video. "Bobcats are predators, not mourners. There must be another explanation." "Like what?" Sarah challenged. Dr. Collins ran a hand through his sandy hair, clearly at a loss. "I don't know. Maybe there's something buried near, the grave that's attracting it, food, or a scent marker." But Sarah wasn't convinced. That night, unable to sleep, she found herself drawn to the small study in the cottage. Previous caretakers had left behind books, records, and personal effects, most of which she hadn't bothered to sort through yet. Now, driven by curiosity, she began sifting through the boxes. In the bottom of a dusty trunk marked Sullivan, she found a leather-bound journal. The handwriting inside was neat but shaky, the words of an aging man. As she read through the entries, a remarkable story began to unfold. Frank Sullivan had been the cemetery guardian for over 30 years. A widower with no children, he had found companionship in the most unlikely form, a bobcat kitten he discovered injured near the cemetery grounds in the spring of 1985. Against all conventional wisdom, Frank had nursed the wild creature back to health, feeding it by hand and even letting it sleep in his cottage during its recovery. "Rusty has his own ways of showing gratitude," Frank had written. "He brings me small treasures, a particularly smooth stone, a vibrant maple leaf, a perfect pine cone. I've started a collection of his gifts on my windowsill." As Sarah read on, she discovered that Frank and the bobcat had formed an unusual bond. Although Rusty eventually returned to the wild, he continued to visit Frank regularly for years, sometimes disappearing for months, only to return as if no time had passed. The journal entries spoke of their silent companionship, Frank talking about his day while the bobcat listened, the two sharing space in a way that defied natural order. The final entry was dated just weeks before Frank's passing. "I wonder if Rusty will miss me when I'm gone. I've asked Walter to continue putting out food for him just in case. Some connections, I believe, transcend the boundaries we humans so arbitrarily draw between species, between life and what comes after." Sarah closed the journal, her mind racing. Could the bobcat currently visiting the cemetery actually be the same one Frank had rescued all those years ago? It seemed impossible. Bobcats typically lived 10-12 years in the wild. But what if Frank's Rusty had offspring? Could this behavior, this connection to a specific place and person, have been passed down somehow? The next morning, she arrived at the cemetery earlier than usual, hoping to observe the bobcat without disturbing it. True to form, the animal was already at Frank's grave, this time with a crimson maple leaf placed delicately on the headstone. "Hello, Rusty," Sarah said softly, maintaining a respectful distance. The bobcat's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, but it didn't run. Instead, it turned its head slowly to regard her with intelligent eyes that seemed to hold secrets beyond her understanding. In that moment, standing among the gravestones with mist swirling around her ankles and the wild creature watching her, with ancient eyes, Sarah felt something shift in her perception. There was more to this cemetery, to this town, than met the eye, and somehow she knew that unraveling the mystery of the bobcat and Frank Sullivan would change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. What she didn't know was that the journal she had found was only the beginning, that Frank Sullivan's story was intertwined with the history of Pinewood Haven itself, and that the bobcat's presence was stirring up long-buried secrets that some in the town would prefer to remain hidden. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the cemetery grounds, Sarah made a decision. She would get to the bottom of this mystery, no matter where it led her. Word about the cemetery bobcat spread quickly through Pinewood Haven. What began as curious whispers among the locals soon evolved into a full-blown local phenomenon. Some townspeople began visiting the cemetery, not to pay respects to departed loved ones, but to catch a glimpse of the mysterious feline that seemed to defy natural behavior. "It's becoming a circus," Walter complained to Sarah one afternoon, as they watched a group of teenagers trying to take selfies with the bobcat in the background. Frank would have hated all this attention. Sarah nodded in agreement. The bobcat had become increasingly agitated by the constant stream of visitors, sometimes disappearing into the wooded area behind the cemetery for hours at a time. She felt protective of the creature and the sacred ritual it seemed determined to perform. "Maybe we should restrict access to that section of the cemetery," she suggested, "at least until the novelty wears off." But before they could implement any changes, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at the caretaker's cottage. Mayor Richard Thompson was a tall, imposing figure with silver-streaked hair and the practiced smile of a career politician. He arrived unannounced on a Thursday afternoon, his expensive SUV looking out of place on the narrow cemetery hearth. "Miss Mitchell," he greeted her with a firm handshake, "I hope I'm not interrupting. I wanted to discuss this situation we have with the wild animal on cemetery grounds." Sarah invited him in reluctantly, noticing how his eyes surveyed the modest cottage with barely concealed disdain. "Coffee?" she offered. "No, thank you, this won't take long." Mayor Thompson settled into a chair, his posture rigid. "The town council is concerned about the safety implications of having a predator freely roaming a public space. We're considering bringing in wildlife control to relocate the animal." Sarah felt her heart sink. "With all due respect, Mayor, the bobcat hasn't shown any aggressive behavior. It keeps to itself and poses no threat to visitors who maintain a proper distance." "Nevertheless," he continued as if she hadn't spoken, "the liability issues are significant. Plus, there's the matter of decorum. A cemetery should be a place of dignity, not a wildlife attraction." Something in his tone made Sarah suspicious. His concern seemed rehearsed, as if there was an agenda beneath his words. "The bobcat has been coming here for years, according to Walter," she countered. "Why is it suddenly an issue now?" A fleeting expression, something between annoyance and discomfort, crossed the mayor's face before his political mask slipped back into place. "Times change, Miss Mitchell. Pinewood Haven is growing. We're in talks with developers about expanding the town's boundaries, which includes potential rezoning of some of the land adjacent to the cemetery." And there it was, the real reason for his visit. After the mayor left, Sarah immediately called Dr. Collins, explaining the situation. "If they bring in wildlife control, what will happen to the bobcat? Best case scenario? Relocation to a wildlife sanctuary, likely several states away," Jeremy replied. "But bobcats are territorial. Removal from familiar territory can be extremely stressful, sometimes fatal." Sarah couldn't let that happen. Something about the mayor's sudden interest in cemetery matters felt wrong. That evening, she returned to Frank Sullivan's journal, hoping to find something, anything, that might help protect the bobcat and its curious ritual. As she delved deeper into Frank's writings, she discovered entries that hadn't caught her attention before. Frank had been more than just the cemetery caretaker. He had been a passionate local historian and environmental advocate. Several entries mentioned conflicts with the Thompson family over land use and conservation efforts. "Richard Thompson Sr. approached me again about selling the northeastern parcel," one entry from 1992 read. "I reminded him that the land is protected under the cemetery trust. He didn't take it well. The Thompsons have never understood that some things are worth more than money." Sarah's curiosity was piqued. She pulled out the cemetery's property maps, studying the boundaries carefully. The northeastern section, which bordered what was now a nature preserve, included the wooded area where the bobcat often disappeared to when it wasn't at Frank's grave. The next morning, she decided to follow the bobcat's path. After its usual vigil at Frank's grave, the wild feline retreated into the woods as it often did. Keeping a safe distance, Sarah tracked its movement through the underbrush, deeper into the forest than she had ventured before. After nearly 20 minutes of careful navigation through increasingly dense vegetation, she emerged into a small clearing. What she found there stopped her in her tracks. Nestled among ancient oak trees was a small, weathered cabin, almost invisible among the foliage. It appeared abandoned, its windows boarded up and its wooden walls reclaimed by climbing vines. To her astonishment, the bobcat approached the cabin with familiar ease, slipping through a small opening near the foundation. Sarah waited, heart pounding, before cautiously approaching the structure. Through a crack in one of the boarded windows, she could see the bobcat inside, curled up on what looked like an old, faded blanket in the corner of the single room. The cabin's interior was sparse but not entirely empty. A simple table and chair remained, along with a cast-iron stove and shelves lined with dusty jars and books. It appeared to have been someone's retreat, preserved by the forest's embrace. When Sarah returned to the cemetery, she immediately sought out Walter, who was trimming hedges near the chapel. "Walter, did Frank have a cabin in the woods, beyond the cemetery's northeastern boundary?" The old groundskeeper paused, leaning on his shears as he studied her face. "You found it then," he said, not really a question. "Frank's sanctuary." "The bobcat goes there," Sarah explained. "It has some kind of bed inside." Walter nodded slowly. "Frank built that place in the 70s, before environmental regulations got strict. It was his getaway. After his wife Eleanor passed, he spent more time there than at the cottage. Said he felt closer to nature, and to her, out there. And the land? It's part of the cemetery trust. It's complicated," Walter sighed. "The cabin itself sits on what was originally Sullivan family land. Frank's grandfather was one of the town founders. The property got incorporated into the cemetery trust later, but there's been disputes about the exact boundaries for decades." Sarah thought about Mayor Thompson's mention of development plans. "Do you think that's why the mayor suddenly wants the bobcat gone? Because they're planning to develop that area?" "Wouldn't surprise me," Walter said grimly. "The Thompsons have had their eye on that land since before you were born. It's the last undeveloped parcel with road access on that side of town, worth millions now, I'd wager." That evening, Sarah made a decision. She would need to learn more about the cemetery trust, the property boundaries, and exactly what Frank had been protecting all those years. But first, she needed allies. She called Dr. Collins again, this time inviting him to meet her at the cottage the next day. "Bring any information you have about bobcat behavior and conservation laws," she instructed. "I think I know why Mayor Thompson is so interested in removing our cemetery guardian." What Sarah didn't anticipate was that her phone call would be overheard. In a town as small as Pinewood Haven, information traveled quickly, especially when it threatened powerful interests. By the time Dr. Collins arrived at the caretaker's cottage the following afternoon, others had already been alerted to her investigation. "You look like you haven't slept," Jeremy commented as Sarah ushered him inside. "I haven't really," she admitted, spreading out photocopies of town records, property maps, and excerpts from Frank's journal across her kitchen table. "I've been researching all night. The more I dig, the more convinced I am that there's something bigger going on here." Jeremy examined the materials with growing interest. "So you think the mayor wants the bobcat gone because it's drawing attention to land they want to develop? Land that may not legally be theirs to develop?" "Exactly. And there's more." Sarah pointed to an old photograph she'd found tucked inside Frank's journal. It showed a much younger Frank standing proudly beside a conservation award. Frank Sullivan was a dedicated environmentalist. He discovered something on that land, something important enough that he fought to protect it his entire life. As they pored over the documents, a soft knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Sarah opened it to find an elderly woman she recognized from town, but had never spoken to before. "Miss Mitchell, I'm Margaret Wheeler. I was Frank Sullivan's neighbor for many years." The woman's eyes were kind but serious. "I understand you've been asking questions about Frank and the northeastern woods. I think it's time you heard the full story." Sarah invited Margaret inside, introducing her to Jeremy. As the three settled, in the small living room, Margaret gazed out the window toward Frank's grave, visible in the distance. The Bobcat was there, maintaining its silent vigil as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cemetery grounds. "Frank and I grew up together in Pinewood Haven," Margaret began. "He loved this town and its history with his whole heart. But what very few people know is that the cabin in the woods wasn't just a retreat. It was a guardian post." "A guardian post," Sarah repeated. Margaret nodded solemnly. "The land beyond the cemetery isn't just valuable real estate, Miss Mitchell. It contains something the Sullivan family has protected for generations, something the Thompson family has coveted just as long." As Margaret Wheeler began to reveal secrets that had been buried for decades, Sarah realized that the mystery of the Bobcat was merely the surface of a much deeper story, one that would shake the foundations of Pinewood Haven and force its residents to confront a history many had worked hard to forget. Margaret Wheeler's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the cup of tea Sarah offered. The late afternoon light filtered through the cottage windows, casting a warm glow that belied the intensity of the conversation about to unfold. "The Sullivan family has been in Pinewood Haven since before it was even called that," Margaret began. "Frank's great-grandfather, Ezekiel Sullivan, was one of the original settlers. He came here in 1843, not for the timber or farmland like most, but because of what he discovered in those hills." Sarah and Jeremy exchanged glances, both leaning forward with interest. "The northeastern woods contain one of the oldest and most diverse ecosystems in the state," Margaret continued. "But that's not all. Beneath the forest floor lies a network of underground springs that feed into the town's aquifer. The water there is exceptionally pure. Some say it has healing properties." "Healing properties?" Jeremy raised an eyebrow skeptically. Margaret smiled patiently. "I know how it sounds, Dr. Collins, but scientific studies conducted in the 1970s confirmed that the water contains a unique mineral composition not found anywhere else in the region. Several pharmaceutical companies expressed interest in harvesting these minerals, but Frank fought tooth and nail to prevent it. And the Thompson family wanted to capitalize on this resource," Sarah deduced. "The Thompsons and Sullivans have been at odds for generations," Margaret nodded. "Where the Sullivans saw something to protect, the Thompsons saw profit. Richard Sr. tried to buy the land outright in the 80s. When that failed, he attempted to challenge the cemetery trust's claim to the property, which explains why his son is so eager to develop it now," Jeremy mused. "But what does this have to do with the Bobcat?" Margaret's expression softened. "Frank believed that the land chose its own guardians. His family had been official caretakers for generations, but he used to say that the real protectors were the creatures that made the forest their home. The Bobcat was special to him, a symbol of the wild spirit that needed preservation. So the Bobcat staying at his grave is continuing its role as guardian," Margaret finished. "At least, that's what Frank would have believed." While Jeremy still looked dubious, Sarah found herself considering the possibility. She'd witnessed firsthand the unusual behavior of the wild feline, its deliberate placement of objects on Frank's grave, its routine journeys to the cabin, its watchful presence. "There's something else you should know," Margaret added, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Frank left behind more than just his journal. There's a metal box buried beneath the floorboards in the cabin. He showed it to me once, years ago. It contains documents, legal papers, scientific reports, maps, everything needed to establish the ecological importance of the land and prevent its development. Sarah's heart raced. If we could find those documents. It won't be that simple, Margaret cautioned. The Thompsons have powerful allies, and Richard Jr. has been mayor for almost a decade. He's built his reputation on bringing economic growth to Pinewood Haven. A development project of this scale would cement his legacy. The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's phone. It was Walter, his voice urgent. "Miss Mitchell, you need to get to the cemetery right away. There are men here. They say they're from animal control, but I've never seen them before. They've set up traps near Frank's grave." Sarah jumped to her feet. "We have to go. Now." By the time they arrived at the cemetery, a confrontation was already underway. Walter stood blocking the path to Frank's grave, his wiry frame tense with defiance. Facing him were two men in uniforms, accompanied by none other than Mayor Thompson himself. "This is a public safety matter, Mr. Jenkins," the mayor was saying, his voice carrying across the cemetery grounds. "Please step aside and allow these professionals to do their job." "These aren't county animal control officers," Walter fired back. "I've worked with every wildlife official in this region for 40 years. I don't know these men." Sarah strode forward, Jeremy and Margaret close. Behind, "Mayor Thompson, what's going on here?" The mayor's expression flickered with annoyance before settling into a practiced smile. "Miss Mitchell, these gentlemen are wildlife specialists from a private company. Given the urgency of the situation, the council authorized their hiring, rather than waiting for county resources." "What urgency?" Sarah challenged. "The Bobcat has been coming here for months, without incident." "There was a complaint," one of the uniformed men offered. "A visitor reported feeling threatened yesterday." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "That's convenient timing. And where exactly are you planning to relocate the Bobcat if you capture it?" The men exchanged glances, and the mayor stepped in smoothly. Wildlife Sanctuary in Montana has agreed to take it. Now, if you'll excuse us." "I don't think so," Jeremy interrupted, pulling out his phone. "As the town's veterinarian, I have some authority in matters concerning animal welfare. I'd like to see the proper permits for trapping a protected species, and I'll need to contact the state wildlife department to verify the relocation plan." The mayor's facade of pleasantness cracked. "This is town business, Dr. Collins. Your services aren't required." "Actually," Margaret Wheeler stepped forward, her voice stronger than her frail appearance suggested, "this is Sullivan family business, and as the executor of Frank Sullivan's estate, I have something to say about it." A hush fell over the group. Even Mayor Thompson looked taken aback. "Frank's will was quite specific," Margaret continued, reaching into her purse to withdraw a folded document. "The northeastern section of the cemetery grounds, including the wooded area beyond, was placed under a conservation easement. No development, no disturbance of wildlife, no exceptions." "That's impossible," the mayor sputtered. "The town council reviewed all property records before approving the preliminary development plans. There was no easement." "Because it wasn't filed with the town," Margaret smiled thinly. "Frank didn't trust the local government for obvious reasons. The easement was registered with the State Conservation Department and the Federal Land Trust. I have copies here if you'd care to see them." It was a bluff. Sarah could tell from the slight tremor in Margaret's voice, but a convincing one. The mayor hesitated, clearly recalculating his approach. "Even if such an easement exists," he finally said, "it doesn't change the fact that we have a wild predator frequenting a public space. The safety concern remains valid." "Then let's address that concern properly," Sarah suggested. "We can cordon off the area around Frank's grave, post educational signs about keeping a safe distance from wildlife, even adjust cemetery hours if necessary. But removing the Bobcat isn't the answer." The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for an unexpected intervention. A soft rustle from the nearby trees drew everyone's attention. The bobcat had appeared, its tawny coat almost glowing in the late afternoon sun. It stood at the edge of the cemetery, watching the assembled humans with unblinking eyes. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, with deliberate slowness, the wild feline began walking toward Frank's grave. It moved with quiet dignity, ignoring the traps that had been set in its path, navigating around them as if they were merely inconvenient obstacles. Upon reaching the headstone, the bobcat placed something on top, a small, vivid wildflower, its purple petals bright against the grey stone. The simple act, performed with such apparent intentionality, left even the wildlife specialists speechless. "I think," Walter said into the silence, "that Frank's friend here has made its opinion known." The moment was broken by the sound of approaching vehicles. 3 cars pulled up to the cemetery gates, and out stepped a diverse group: Judy Ramirez, editor of the local newspaper; Ben Harper, head of the town's historical society, and several other prominent community members. "What's going on here?" Judy called out, camera in hand. "We received an anonymous tip that there was some kind of dispute at the cemetery." Mayor Thompson's face flushed. "This is a routine wildlife management situation, nothing more." "Really?" Judy raised her camera, snapping photos of the traps. "Because it looks like an attempt to remove Pinewood Haven's most famous resident. Our readers would be very interested in that story." Ben Harper stepped forward, addressing Sarah directly. "Miss Mitchell, the Historical Society has been researching the Sullivan family's contributions to Pinewood Haven. We've uncovered some fascinating documents regarding the northeastern forest and its significance to our town's heritage." The balance of power was shifting palpably. Mayor Thompson, sensing the changing winds, adopted a conciliatory tone. "Perhaps we've been hasty. A public discussion about the best approach to this unique situation would be beneficial." "I think that's wise," Sarah agreed, maintaining a neutral expression despite her inner triumph. "In the meantime, I suggest we remove these traps and respect the status quo while the community deliberates." With reluctance, the mayor nodded to the wildlife specialists, who began dismantling their equipment. As the confrontation dispersed, Sarah exchanged meaningful glances with Jeremy, Walter, and Margaret. They had won this round, but the battle was far from over. Later that evening, after the excitement had died down, Sarah found herself alone at the caretaker's cottage, reviewing the day's events. The bobcat had returned to the woods after its dramatic appearance, seemingly unconcerned by the human drama that had unfolded around it. A knock at the door revealed Jeremy, holding a bottle of wine and wearing a tired smile. "Thought you could use this after today." Sarah welcomed him in, grateful for the company. As they sat on her small porch overlooking the moonlit cemetery, Jeremy asked the question that had been lingering in both their minds. "Do you think Margaret was telling the truth about the conservation easement?" Sarah took a thoughtful sip of wine. "I think she believes it exists. Whether Frank actually filed it or not is another question. We need to find that metal box she mentioned." "You're planning to go to the cabin, aren't you?" She nodded. "Tomorrow. I want to see what Frank left behind, what he thought was important enough to protect all these years." Jeremy studied her with newfound respect. "You know, when you first took this job, I figured you were just passing through, another city person seeking temporary rural charm before heading back to civilization." "That was the plan," Sarah admitted. "But there's something about this place, about this story. I feel connected to it somehow." As they talked into the night, neither noticed the figure watching from the shadows of the cemetery, a silhouette too tall and angular to be the bobcat. Someone else had taken an interest in Sarah Mitchell's investigation, someone with their own stake in the secrets of Pinewood Haven. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, a perfect Vermont autumn day. Sarah prepared for her expedition to the cabin, packing water, a flashlight, and tools that might help locate the hidden box. What she discovered there would change everything, not just for the Bobcat and the disputed land, but for Sarah herself and her understanding of what it meant to be a guardian of something greater than oneself. The forest seemed different this morning, more alive, more aware. As Sarah made her way along the barely visible path toward Frank's cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, not just by the birds and squirrels that chattered in the canopy above, but by something more intent, more purposeful. "I'm not here to disturb anything," she found herself saying aloud, feeling slightly foolish but compelled nonetheless. "I'm trying to help." The words hung in the crisp air as she continued forward, ducking under low-hanging branches and navigating around fallen logs. When she finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood, she was surprised to find she wasn't alone. The Bobcat sat on the cabin's weathered porch, tail wrapped neatly around its paws, regarding her with those intelligent amber eyes. It made no move to run as she approached, though it remained alert, ears twitching at every sound from the surrounding woods. "Hello again," Sarah said softly, maintaining a respectful distance. "I'm looking for something Frank left behind. Something important." The wild feline blinked slowly, then stood and stretched in a leisurely fashion before jumping down from the porch and disappearing around the side of the cabin. Curious, Sarah followed. The Bobcat was waiting beside a small garden plot that had long since gone wild, pawing at the overgrown soil near a large moss-covered rock. Intrigued, Sarah approached the spot. The rock appeared to be some kind of marker, though any inscription it might have once borne had been worn away by time and weather. Kneeling down, she began to clear away the vegetation around its base. Her fingers met something smooth and artificial beneath the tangle of roots and soil, a small metal container roughly the size of a shoebox. With trembling hands, she extracted it from the earth. It wasn't locked, though the lid was stiff with age and corrosion. Inside, protected by a sealed plastic bag, was exactly what Margaret had described: a collection of documents, photographs, and a smaller sealed envelope with Sarah's name written on it in faded ink. Her name. Sarah stared at the envelope in disbelief. How could Frank Sullivan, who had passed away years before she even heard of Pinewood Haven, have left something addressed specifically to her? Before she could open it, a voice called out from the direction of the path. "Find anything interesting?" Sarah whirled around to see Mayor Thompson standing at the edge of the clearing, his expensive hiking boots and outdoor gear looking oddly out of place among the wild growth. Behind him stood a younger man in a business suit, clutching a leather portfolio and looking distinctly uncomfortable in the forest setting. "Mayor Thompson," Sarah acknowledged, instinctively moving to shield the metal box from view. "This is private property." "Actually," the mayor smiled thinly, "that's a matter of some debate, which is why I brought Mr. Daniels here from the County Land Registry Office. We've been reviewing the historical property boundaries of Pinewood Haven." The young man in the suit nodded nervously. "According to the original survey maps from 1905, this parcel falls just outside the Cemetery Trust's holdings." "And that survey was contested," Sarah countered, recalling details from Frank's journal. "The Sullivan family filed an appeal that was never properly resolved." "Ancient history," the mayor waved dismissively. "The point is, Miss Mitchell, you're trespassing on land that will soon be part of Pinewood Haven's exciting new development project, the Ridges at Pinewood, a luxury eco-community that will bring jobs and tax revenue to our town." "Eco-community?" Sarah couldn't hide her skepticism. "On land you plan to clear-cut and build over?" The mayor's practiced smile didn't waver. "Our developers are very environmentally conscious. They'll preserve select trees and incorporate natural elements into the design. Progress and preservation can coexist, Miss Mitchell," His eyes dropped to the metal box in her hands. "I see you've found something that belongs to the town. As mayor, I should take that into custody until ownership can be properly established." Sarah took a step back, clutching the box tighter. This was left by Frank Sullivan. It contains personal effects and documents related to his family's history with this land. All the more reason it should be properly archived by the town. "Historical Society," Mayor Thompson insisted, extending his hand. "We wouldn't want anything important to be misplaced." The tension in the clearing was palpable. Sarah knew she was outnumbered and legally uncertain about her position. But something, intuition perhaps, or the weight of Frank's legacy, told her she couldn't surrender the box. A rustling from the underbrush broke the standoff. The Bobcat had returned, now standing halfway between Sarah and the mayor. It made no aggressive moves, but its presence was unmistakably protective, its amber eyes fixed on the intruders with unnerving intensity. The land registry clerk took an involuntary step back. "Sir, maybe we should—" "It's just a wild animal," the mayor said irritably, though he too seemed unsettled by the Bobcat's appearance. "It won't attack unless provoked." As if on cue, a chorus of voices called from the forest path. "Sarah, are you out here?" Jeremy emerged into the clearing first, followed by Walter, Margaret, and several other townspeople Sarah recognized from yesterday's confrontation at the cemetery. Among them was Judy Ramirez, her camera already raised and capturing the scene. Well, Judy smiled, her journalist's instincts clearly fired up. Mayor Thompson taking a personal interest in forest conservation, this will make quite the story. The mayor's confidence visibly faltered at the appearance of witnesses, especially ones with cameras. "We're conducting official town business, Ms. Ramirez. This doesn't concern you." "Actually," Ben Harper stepped forward, "it concerns all of us. The Historical Society has voted to pursue landmark status for this area based on its cultural and historical significance to Pinewood Haven. And I've contacted the State Environmental Agency," Jeremy added. "They're sending a team to assess the ecological value of the underground springs Margaret told us about." Outflanked and increasingly outnumbered, Mayor Thompson attempted to regain control of the situation. "This is exactly why we have town council meetings. To discuss these matters in a proper forum, not out here in the woods like some kind of vigilante environmentalist group." "Then let's schedule one," Sarah proposed, still holding the metal box close. "A town hall meeting where all perspectives can be heard. Until then, this land and its contents remain under dispute, and I'll be keeping this safe." The mayor studied the assembled group, calculation evident in his eyes. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Fine. Town hall this Friday, 7 o'clock. We'll settle this once and for all." With that, he turned and stalked back down the path, the clerk hurrying after him. Only when they had disappeared from view did Sarah allow herself to breathe normally again. "Thank you all for coming. How did you know where to find me?" "We didn't," Jeremy admitted. "We were looking for you at the cemetery when we ran into a group of surveyors marking boundaries. Didn't take much to figure out what was happening. The plus," Walter added with a wink, "I've been watching the mayor's movements for years. When he heads for the woods, trouble usually follows." With the immediate threat gone, curiosity about the metal box took precedence. They returned to the caretaker's cottage, where Sarah carefully laid out the contents on her kitchen table. The documents included land surveys, biological studies of the forest ecosystem, and legal papers establishing the Sullivan family's historical claim to the northeastern woods. But it was the sealed envelope with her name that drew everyone's attention. "How is this possible?" Sarah wondered aloud. "Frank couldn't have known me." Margaret touched the envelope gently. "Frank had insights that most people couldn't understand. Open it, dear. It was meant for you." With trembling fingers, Sarah broke the seal and unfolded a single sheet of paper, covered in the same neat but shaky handwriting she'd come to recognize from the journal. "To the caretaker who finds this letter," it began, "if you're reading this, you've already met my friend Rusty, and you've noticed there's something special about him and his connection to this place. You might not believe in such things, I didn't either, until I experienced them firsthand. But some bonds transcend what we think we know about the natural world." Sarah glanced up at the others before continuing to read aloud. "The northeastern woods aren't just trees and rocks. They're a sanctuary, a place where the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary grows thin. The springs beneath the forest floor contain minerals with remarkable properties. Healing. Properties that modern science is only beginning to understand. I've protected this land my whole life because I believe that some places are meant to remain wild, untamed, and mysterious." Walter nodded solemnly. "Frank always said that. The challenge now falls to you," Sarah continued reading. "You'll face opposition from those who see only profit where they should see wonder. But you won't be alone. The land chooses its guardians, both human and otherwise. Trust the signs you're given, and trust yourself." The letter was signed simply, "Frank Sullivan, Guardian of Pinewood Haven." A reverent silence fell over the group as Sarah carefully folded the letter and placed it back in its envelope. "He knew someone would come," Margaret said softly. "Someone who would understand. But how could he have known it would be me specifically?" Sarah still couldn't wrap her mind around it. Walter chuckled. "Frank wasn't big on coincidences. He believed everything happened for a reason, that people were drawn to places where they were needed." The week leading up to the town hall meeting was a flurry of activity. Sarah and her allies gathered evidence, prepared presentations, and rallied community support. Word about the mysterious Bobcat, the hidden springs, and the mayor's development plans spread throughout Pinewood Haven, drawing interest from even the most politically disengaged residents. The Bobcat, meanwhile, continued its daily ritual at Frank's grave, seemingly oblivious to the human controversy swirling around it. Sarah found herself talking to the wild creature during her morning rounds, sharing her plans and concerns as if it could understand. Perhaps in some way it did. By Friday evening, the town hall was packed beyond capacity. People spilled out the doors and gathered around open windows, determined to witness the proceedings. Mayor Thompson sat at the front, flanked by developers in expensive suits and lawyers with briefcases full of documents. On the opposite side sat Sarah, with Jeremy, Walter, Margaret, and their growing coalition of supporters. The metal box and its contents were displayed on a table between them, along with enlarged photographs of the Bobcat at Frank's grave and the hidden springs in the northeastern woods. The mayor spoke first, outlining his vision for economic development and growth. The proposed luxury community would bring jobs, tax revenue, and prestige to Pinewood Haven. Yes, some forest would be cleared, but responsible environmental stewardship would be maintained throughout the process. When it was Sarah's turn, she didn't rely on economic arguments or legal technicalities. Instead, she told a story, Frank's story, the Bobcat story, and now her own. Pinewood Haven isn't just a dot on a map, she concluded, her voice steady despite her nerves. It's a place with history, with character, with mysteries worth preserving. The Bobcat that visits Frank Sullivan's grave every day isn't just a curiosity. It's a reminder that there are connections in this world that we don't fully understand but should respect nonetheless. She held up the scientific studies from Frank's metal box. These springs aren't just water, they're a unique ecosystem that once destroyed can never be recovered. And this land isn't just real estate, it's a legacy that was entrusted to all of us. A legacy of preservation over profit, of wonder over development. The room had fallen completely silent, every eye fixed on Sarah as she delivered her final appeal. I came to Pinewood Haven seeking quiet, seeking escape. What I found instead was purpose. Frank Sullivan protected these woods for decades. Now it's our turn, not just for ourselves, but for those who will come after us, who deserve to know that there are still places where mystery and nature reign, where a wild thing can mourn a human friend, and where a community can choose preservation over progress. The vote that followed wasn't even close. By an overwhelming majority, the townspeople of Pinewood Haven rejected the mayor's development proposal and approved a motion to establish a permanent nature preserve on the contested land, with the Cemetery Trust as its steward. Mayor Thompson left the meeting early, his political future clearly in jeopardy. The developers and their lawyers packed up their glossy presentations and slipped away, already calculating their losses. But for Sarah and her friends, the night marked not an ending but a beginning. In the weeks that followed, much changed in Pinewood Haven. A conservation committee was formed, with Sarah and Jeremy as founding members. The hidden springs were studied by scientists who confirmed their unique mineral composition. Frank's cabin was carefully restored as a research station and visitor center for the newly established Sullivan Nature Preserve. And the Bobcat? It continued its daily visits to Frank's grave, undisturbed by the gentle flow of respectful visitors who came to witness its ritual. Sometimes it would bring small offerings, leaves, stones, feathers, placing them with deliberate care on the headstone before sitting in silent vigil. Sarah had a bench installed nearby, where she would often sit during her lunch breaks, sometimes reading aloud from Frank's journal. On occasion, the Bobcat would acknowledge her presence with a slow blink or a twitch of its tufted ears, a subtle recognition between fellow guardians. One crisp autumn morning, almost a year after Sarah had first come to Pinewood Haven, she arrived at the cemetery to find something unusual. The Bobcat was there, as always, but this time it wasn't alone. A smaller version of itself, clearly a young Bobcat, perhaps 4 or 5 months old, sat beside it, watching the older feline with attentive eyes. As Sarah watched, breath caught. In her throat, the adult Bobcat picked up a smooth stone and placed it on Frank's grave with its usual care. Then, after a moment's hesitation, the younger one mimicked the action, selecting a bright maple leaf and setting it beside the stone. "A new guardian," Walter murmured, having silently joined Sarah in her observation. "The tradition continues." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. In that moment, she understood what Frank had meant in his letter about bonds that transcended the ordinary. Some connections didn't end with separation or departure. They persisted, transformed, renewed themselves in unexpected ways. The adult Bobcat turned its amber gaze towards Sarah, and she could have sworn she saw recognition there, not just of her as a familiar human, but of her role as a fellow keeper of something precious and mysterious. Then, with unhurried dignity, it led its young companion back toward the woods that would always remain wild, always remain free. Sarah watched them go, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. She had come to Pinewood Haven seeking escape and had found instead a place where she belonged, a community worth fighting for and a legacy worth preserving. The mystery of the cemetery Bobcat had changed her life, just as it had changed the town itself. A reminder that even in the most ordinary places, extraordinary connections could flourish. In the quiet of the cemetery, with autumn leaves drifting down around her and the distant figures of the Bobcats disappearing into the protected forest, Sarah Mitchell finally understood what it meant to be a guardian. Not just of land or animals or memory, but of the delicate, mysterious threads that connected all living things, threads that, once recognized, could never be broken. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Sarah and the faithful Bobcat has touched your heart. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories. Find it by clicking the link on your left. If you enjoyed this tale about extraordinary bonds and natural preservation, don't forget to subscribe into our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day we bring unique stories that explore life's complexities and unexpected connections. Don't miss our upcoming content. We have many more mysteries of the heart waiting to be shared. We look forward to reading your thoughts in the comments section below.